Hey everybody, this video is going to talk about how we can split our files into a C++ project. So far in our class, we have been coding in a flat file, meaning one single file that has sort of three parts to it that we've been working on. It's got the class definition part where we actually define the class. Then it has a whole implementation part where we define outside of the class, we define some of those class methods. And then finally, there's the third part, which is our main function. So what this video is going to demonstrate is, well, how can we actually take that flat single file and go ahead and split it up into separate files? And this will represent a more classic C++ project. So let's look at that. In a typical C++ project, and let me put a label here, typical. And this is just a generic template for a typical C++ project. I'm going to do it for one class, but as we introduce new classes, then the number of files will grow accordingly. So this is just for one single class. And what we will have are three files: a definition file, and this is also known as a header file. The second is going to be an implementation file. And then finally, third is going to be our demo, our main, number of things that we can call it. But this is basically going to be our main program. So what goes into each of these is critical to know. Inside this definition file is just going to be our class declaration, our definition. And all of the code here. So if we were doing a goat class, well, that declaration would all go into the header file. And then importantly, we would name this file the class name.h. So in this case, it would be called goat.h. The .h stands for header. And don't forget the capitalization. We want the goat file to match the class name. So goat.h then would end up being the first file in our new project. The second is our implementation. And this is where we put all of the various implementation methods that we've coded. Those all go in there. So like if we had, let's take a constructor, for example, goat. This would go in there. Any other types of functions that we need for setters, getters, miscellaneous methods, all of those then would be put in the implementation file. And this file is just simply going to be called goat.cpp. So it's important that the two names are identical, goat.h, goat.cpp, so that the compiler can properly bind those two together, and so that they can kind of find each other as well. And then, of course, our main program, our demo, is just going to be our normal demo. Now, we have a couple of tasks to do. Let me mention that this is going to be main.cpp. Now we have a couple of tasks to do. One task that we need to do is in our header file. We need to put a couple of what are called include guards in there. Include guards, and well, what are those? Well, an include guard is going to sort of help us make sure that we're not doing multiple definitions. So that header file, if this is the content of our header file, the class definition, class goat, class chair, class car, whatever we've got, What we'll do is up here and below here, we'll put a couple of include guards. Now, an include guard again is going to help us prevent multiple compilations of the same class. This can happen, since we're going to kind of include various header files in our code. It could happen where maybe one header file or one include statement references another, which goes back and references itself. So we might have this circular idea happening, and an include guard is going to stop all of that coding drama, that processing drama, and just simply give us the ability to say, all right, if this class hasn't yet been declared, go ahead and declare it. But if the class has been declared, then skip it. So that's what an include guard will do for us. So that the ones that we'll do is going to be the if no definition statement, and it's a preprocessor directive preceded by the pound sign. And what we'll do here is if NDEF, if no definition exists for this class, and the way that we track that is actually through a constant name. And you usually take the class and put an H on it, and that's good enough for the processor to realize, well, what we're trying to deal with. So take the class name, and let's say that we've got a chair. So if there's no definition for this constant called chair underscore H, well, then let's go ahead and define it. Just like that. And then the last statement is just going to be an endif. And again, that's a preprocessor directive preceded by the pound sign. And this is going to, again, give us the little guard saying, all right, if there was some kind of a circular reference with these various include files, this is going to stop that madness from happening and just give us one implementation, okay, one compilation. So then in this code here is going to be our class definition. And let's say we've got a class called a chair. And then there's all the code for it. And there is our terminating brace and semicolon. So then all of that would then go into this header file. Now, our header file, as we know, may contain some methods that have inline functions. And all of the inline function methods would go in here. If a method has more than one statement, well, then that's going to be sort of a fully developed method or function definition. And that's actually going to go into the companion file of the chair.h file. It'll go into the companion, which is going to be a chair.cpp. So knowing how this header file kind of works, well, we can also look at then how chair.cpp would work. So let's look at that. Here, this would be chair.cpp. So of course, the very first thing we need to do is to include the header file. Just like that. And then this file would include all of those various methods that we've defined that have used the scope resolution operator. Perhaps if this is a constructor that we created, and we've got a bunch of nice code in there, well, all of that then would go into here, plus any of the other methods that might be more than one line, because we can kind of outsource that up to the header file as an inline function. So that's going to be what chair.h is going to contain. Now, and then finally, our main.cpp will have just the core of our main program. Now, it's going to be interesting when you start to split your implementation files. It'll be interesting kind of tracking down errors. Most of the errors will come about because the processor needs to know, okay, well, should we be including other things here? For example, in chair.h, if we're using a string variable for a private member variable, we may have to, inside our chair.h, we might have to do an include string. Or We may have to just simply, if we're going to ever have a count statement, let's just go ahead and do, we'll have to include IOStream. And then certainly we'll need the standard namespace. So that'll be very common. Same thing in our implementation file. You know, you have to kind of mix and match and figure out, well, what do we actually need? The implementation file, share.cpp, is absolutely first going to need share.h. That way it will tie the header file to itself. And then of course, if you've got some count statement, if you've got a CERR statement, then you'll need to include those. For CERR, we need, of course, C standard input output. And then it's good to include the namespace statement there as well. So don't be alarmed if the first time you try and compile a project with these separate files and it draws some errors. Don't be alarmed, just sort of trace them down one at a time. Just look at the very first error that's listed and deal with that one first. And it's likely that you're just going to have to include one of the required libraries that the code is going to actually need to compile. So I have a demo here planned, and let me get this up. Let me share now my Eclipse, and we'll kind of go through an actual demo of this. Here in Eclipse, I have this file. So this was that share class, and the sample code is there in the previous module, in module 3. And so what I want to do here is take this class. It's a flat file. Here's our class definition. Here are all of the class implementation, the methods. And then finally, here is our main program. And what I want to do here is, okay, well, let's split this up into a quote proper C++ project that splits out the header, the implementation, and the class. And the reason that we do this in C++, first of all, is a matter of convention. It's to help with some data privacy. Sometimes all you need is the class definition. Sometimes you need both. It's a good idea to split those up so that if you have to work on one, it just makes it very easily contained, very neatly contained. So here's the steps that we would follow then to split up these classes. First of all, here in my Eclipse, I'm going to go ahead and create using new and then header file. And if you're using a different IDE, you'll just have to figure out how do you create a new file inside the project. And I'm going to create a file called share.h. I'm going to do another one that's called share.cpp. And this will be a source file. And there's share.cpp. So what I'm going to do now is basically take what we had in our main program and just start to parse it out. We're going to split it up. So we know that this class definition absolutely, positively belongs in share.h. So that's what I'm doing. I'm cutting it from there, and I'm going to paste it into this share.h file. Now notice in Eclipse, it already gives you these include guards. Here's the first one. If no definition for share.h, go ahead and define it, and then it gives you the end if statement at the bottom also, which is kind of nice. Now here, clearly, we're going to draw some errors, and we can kind of clear these errors. One is that we're seeing some red underlining on strings, and if we just simply use the standard namespace, and then let's do include IOStream, those should fall away, and there they do. Okay, those errors have now fallen away. All right, so we're on to something. And again, this is just saying, all right, if there's no definition for class or chair.h, go ahead and define it. And here's the class definition. All right, let's keep going. We've got chair.cpp. And what this is going to need is all of these class method definitions. We're going to cut them. And then we're going to paste them over here. Okay, then we can save that file. Let's save everything. Now, the main thing in chair.cpp is that we're going to need to include chair.h. So make sure that you do that. That's going to be its primary source of information for this class. It's got to find chair.h. Now, there are some count statements in here, and we like to get counts and CERR working, we'll have to do those implementation or those libraries. So there's C standard input output, and there's IO stream, and then there's the standard namespace. So all of those should clear any warnings that we might get in the implementation file. So now then, all that's left with our main program here is, of course, we'll need to do this. We'll have to include chair.h. Once we do that, we'll then, it's going to properly reference that file to know where to get its data. Where to get the data to create these objects. And then at this point, I think we're ready to just try and build it and see what happens. And here we did build it. We had no errors, so I'm going to go ahead and run it. And then hopefully we will get the same output as before with the data dump of these chair objects. And there enough, sure enough, there in the console is the chair data. So this is how you go about splitting a flat file into a minimum of 3 files. Again, keeping that structure intact, where a single class is going to be represented by 2 files, a header and an implementation. Now later, when we get to inheritance, and we might be dealing with several classes, well then you would have this dual file setup for each of your classes. Let's say we have a chair class, well that's going to be our header in our implementation. Maybe there's another class that's at play, and we'll have those 2 files as well. So that is, in a nutshell, how we split up our files. And again, to kind of recap the key points, one is here in our chair.h implementation, in our definition file, we've got to include those include guards. That's the biggest thing there. And then most of our code will need the standard namespace and IO stream. In our implementation file here, we've got to include chair.h, and then whatever libraries that we might need to get that to compile. And then finally, in our main.cpp program, our biggest requirement is that we've got to tie the chair class into this code. And how do we do that? Well, we just reference the chair.h file as an include object. All right. So that's it in a nutshell. I hope this helps you get started with your very first exploits into splitting files, and your first lab will be just basically follow this process. And then what we'll do from this point on in the semester is that we will always have our split implementation, header, and demo files. All right, thanks for joining. I hope this helped, and pop a message on the message board if you've got a question about it. All right, thanks everybody.